Okay. Hi, everybody, and good morning to you. This is our 59th program in the Rules for Magic on the Astral Plane. And if all goes well, I hope I will be finished today with this. There's plenty to study, and I hope that you can take advantage of these thoughts and, at the very least, of the reading through of the book, because that is going on along with the commentary. So, we come now to the second phase. This is called salvation from death. We've been dealing with how to sever one's created thought form from oneself and how to have the trust not to follow it into the world and shepherd it too closely. One has to let it work out its own destiny after the severing. We come now to the second phase of our study, of the final words of Rule 11. After that, we begin work with the rules for the etheric plane and for the precipitation of the thought form into the ancient fires of the dense physical plane. We have dealt with salvation from the dangers incident to the creation of thought forms by a human being who has learned or is learning to create on the mental plane. You know, many things can happen. The boomerang effect can happen. The poisoning effect can happen. And, you know, in general, the disruption of the life of the sender. Much could have been said from the standpoint of the inability of the majority of students to think with clarity. Clear thinking involves capacity to dissociate oneself, temporarily at least, from all reactions and activities of an emotional nature. That's one of the factors we have been studying a bit, how to prevent when you want to protect a thought form, how to avoid attaching the desire to speak to it. As long as the astral body is in a state of restless movement and its moods and feelings, its desires and emotions are powerful enough to attract attention. Positive, pure thought processes are not possible. So this is overcoming the Kama-Manas, which links desire and mind together and prevents pure thought. As long as the astral body is in a state of restless movement, and its moods and feelings, its desires and emotions are powerful enough to attract attention. Pure thought processes are not possible. We want to have the mind and the thinking process held steady in the light of the soul, and therefore it must be dissociated from the disturbance of the astral body. So one has to master this necessary phase of objective thinking. So we have been given the dangers, the boomerang effect, the poisoning effect, and the obsessing effect when creating thought forms, and there are some cures for these things. We've just been over them as well. We have to develop a very positive harmlessness, and we have to be vigilant about guarding the doors of thought, and we have to refuse to live in our own thought world, cutting ourselves off from the refreshing currents, we might say, and then finally to learn how to detach oneself from one's thought creations, and that's done in two ways: through the severing and to let the idea go and to work without attachment. Very practical kinds of advice, because we're always thinking, and as disciples of the great ones, we have to learn how to think consciously and in line with the plan. And we must monitor the kind of thinking we do and see if it is truly in line with the divine plan. So here we're talking about whether we can produce positive thought processes, and it takes us right back to the means of yoga by Patanjali, where we have to still the restless modifications of the subtle bodies, not only of the mind, but of the fluid and ever-changing astral body filled with, as it says here, restless movement, moods, feelings, desires, and emotions, until the time comes when there is a more general appreciation of the value of concentration and of meditation, and until the nature of the mind and its modifications are more universally understood. Any further teaching on the subject would be futile. So, 90 years ago, this was coming out roughly, and there has to be an education of the public regarding the value and the purpose of meditation. And that is one of the things I think that we as students of spiritual occultism are equipped to do. And of course, since the time of this writing, the value of meditation has been widely spread in the Western world, and people have engaged in it in a way that heretofore they have not. So in these instructions, he says, I have sought to give an indication of the first steps in esoteric psychology. And as we well know, two books followed and have dealt primarily with the nature and mode of training of the astral body, which is, of course, the great need for the majority of aspirants. Later on in this century, the psychology of the mind, its nature and modifications may be handled in more detail, but the time is not yet. And, I think, did he do that shortly after writing A Treatise on White Magic? It sounds like a more future time is meant here, and no book on psychology followed it. I think this may be perhaps in the new installment beginning in 2025. Okay. Our subject now is the salvation of the body nature, salvation from the body nature through the process of death. Okay, that's our subject. because the body nature is a very confining thing, even though we hold tightly to it. Two things must be borne in mind as we seek to study the means of this salvation. First, by the body, I mean the integrated personality. Okay, well, that we seem to have understood as we go along from the perspective of occultism. The whole personality is the body nature, or the human equipment of physical body, vital or etheric body, the matter or mode of being of the desire nature, and the mind stuff of the lower mind. These, so let's note that, these constitute the sheaths or outer forms of the incarnated soul. And if we can, just get the feeling, let's see here, get the feeling of our of our interiority. When we look at the nature of the personality, we have to find a position behind it all and within it all. And we have to identify that position as a truer sense of identity, the observing consciousness, than that which is observed. Now, that is not easily done by the majority of people, yet they don't see the value of it, and they really maybe don't even know what one is talking about when one speaks of the interior human being. But within and behind the sheaths is something more real, and progressively we call it the soul nature and other aspects of the human energy system. The consciousness aspect is sometimes focused in one and sometimes in another, or is identified with the form or with the soul. The average man works with facility and self-consciousness in the physical and astral bodies. Okay, this we see as we observe humanity at this time and in general. The intelligent and highly evolved man has added to these two the conscious control of his mental apparatus, though only in certain of its aspects, such as the memorizing and analyzing faculties. That used to be the way that the mind was trained, and now there are many more factors of intelligence which have been noted. I'm trying to think when I studied this, but some people have studied the mental processes and come up with more than 100 different processes that can be pursued within the mind. He has also in some cases succeeded in unifying these three into a consciously functioning personality, because not everybody who can think is yet a personality. Unification must occur before we really can be given the name personality. The aspirant is beginning to understand something of the principle of life which is animating the personality, whilst the disciple is utilizing all three because he has coordinated or aligned the soul, mind, and the brain, and is therefore beginning to work with his subjective apparatus or energy aspects. So, okay, here are given the progressions in personality development and its relating to the soul. And different types of human beings, of course, can do different things, and hopefully we are increasingly standing in this place, not just being aware that there's something animating the personality, but as a disciple utilizing all three. That's what we want to be able to do, and to take the soul position, at least the soul in incarnation, and increasingly that kind of detachment and withdrawal, which will make it possible for us to function as the soul or consciousness on the higher mental plane. Okay, now, so, it's interesting to think of the personality as body and as something from which one must be liberated because it is so confining. Secondly, the salvation is brought about through a right understanding of the mystical experience we call death. He keeps describing it in so many different ways that eventually it must appeal to one type of mind or another. Not a cataclysmic end to all consciousness. I had a friend who told me how on the operating table he was fighting for his consciousness, and he felt he was slipping away. And of course, he believed in nothing along these lines. So that was a terrifying experience. But the mystically inclined people, such as we are, having gone through certain Neptunian phases, realize that it is a great adventure. There is an eternally lovely secret of death. It is a great release. And I think it can be undertaken with joy when there is the sense that one has fulfilled one's purpose, when there are very strong ties to unfulfillment or to places or people, then there is a hesitancy to leave, I must say. I'm recalling a story now of Foster Bailey in relation to one of the disciples who had cancer on the ascendant, and she was near to death. But you know how the sign cancer is, it hangs on. And who knows why, in this case, she lingered, hanging on. And Foster, he was a first-rate type, and he said, "For heaven's sake, go." And I guess shortly after that, she did. So the mystical experience we call death, an experience of inner worlds and of higher contacts. He calls it, as I say, by so many different names, and I think he will capture the attention of the type of person for whom the phrase is intended. We have to see, in describing death, which phrase most appeals to any one of us and banishes the fear of death and brings us closer to realizing the beautiful nature of death, the eternally lovely secret of death. And of course, the Tibetan has come and gone, and he knows how to do that. He, as he says, he can speak of the matter as one who knows both sides of the story. So this is to be our theme, and the subject is so immense, undertaken later in esoteric healing. And even there, probably just the ABCs, as the Tibetan would say. The subject is so immense that I can only indicate certain lines along which the aspirant may think, and posit certain premises which he can later elaborate. We shall confine ourselves also primarily to the death of the physical body, though we could, or he could, speak of the time when the desires on the plane of desire are exhausted and the individual continues to go forward and upward into the mental body, and perhaps will be spending or having an experience in Devachan before maybe liberated back into the causal body. Now, it's interesting. Some of these books are seminal. They are seeds of things to come, and that's in Cosmic Fire. There are seeds of so many things that he wrote on later, and here we find the same. So the whole study of death is undertaken extensively, I think, in Esoteric Healing, the 4th volume of the Rays and the Initiations, but the seed perhaps is found here, just like the seed of Esoteric Astrology is found in this book. Let us, so we're thinking, primarily of the death of the physical body. This is that which seems to concern people mostly, and the question of survival is there, and then the question of reincarnation has to be answered. Some may believe in survival, but do they believe in cyclic opportunity to take a new body and progress with one's development and redemptive task? Let us first of all define this mysterious process to which all forms are subject, and which is frequently only the dreaded end, dreaded because it is not understood. Okay, well, I think that it's been said, and the Tibetan has said it, that within a century or two, the fear of death will be greatly reduced through increased understanding. The mind of man is so little developed that fear of the unknown, terror of the unfamiliar, and attachment to form have brought about a situation where one of the most beneficent occurrences in the life cycle of an incarnating Son of God is looked upon as something to be avoided and postponed for as long a time as possible. This captures it, doesn't it? You can only imagine how a mastermind like the Tibetans looks upon the thinking of the average individual, if we can even call it thinking. But he calls it one of the most beneficent occurrences in the life cycle. Again, he has nothing but fine, uplifting things to say about the nature of death. Lovely, releasing, liberating, freedom, Death, if we could but realize it, is one of our most practiced activities. In other words, once the process starts and we start to be liberated, we may begin to recall many other such liberations. That the nature of that type of liberation does not enter the brain, the mind and the brain so much during incarnation, but during the actual process, we might have the thought, this again. We have died many times and shall die again and again, even as the universe dies. Death is essentially a matter of consciousness, change of scene, really. Change of scene. Okay. Death is essentially a matter of consciousness. It's like Pluto, the planet of death, one of the great planets of death anyway, which we are told never kills the consciousness. The consciousness remains, but it has a change of environment and perhaps a transition in which unconsciousness is experienced and one awakens to a new possibility. Is there a complete continuity between the passing out of the physical body and the experiencing of the new environment? Well, maybe for some there is. And DK tells us to practice that or prepare for that by falling asleep consciously. He deals with that in Discipleship in the New Age. We are conscious one moment on the physical plane, and a moment later we have withdrawn onto another plane and are actively conscious there. So it sounds like from this perspective, the transition in the change of consciousness is quick. From this statement, it seems that the transition into the new state of consciousness is rapid. Just as long as our consciousness is identified with the form aspect, death will hold for us its ancient terror. Somehow in the Atlantean days, in some of those days, and in benighted Aryan days, we lost the ability to consciously and at will contact higher worlds, and our identification became exclusively with the outer form. And this was a great reduction in our psyche and induced fear. Ancient terror, those are pretty strong words, and they imply that this has been going on for a long time. This viewing of death as a horrific experience for millions of years, I suspect. Just as soon as we know ourselves to be souls, and I would say through meditation, right, and find that we are capable of focusing our consciousness or sense of awareness in any form or on any plane at will or in any direction within the form of God, we shall no longer fear death. So the liberation of consciousness will reduce the fear of death. Just as soon as we know ourselves to be souls, so pratyahara has been in effect the withdrawal, and we have disidentified with all the things that we thought we were, and find that we are capable of focusing our consciousness or sense of awareness in any form, within reason, of course. We can't necessarily ascend immediately to the highest planes, or on any plane at will, of those planes accessible to us, I would say, or in any direction within the form of God, we shall no longer know death. Not even fear death, but know death. So the fear of death is continually reduced as our consciousness becomes more flexible, freer, more capable of ascending and descending. I think what people fear the most is the annihilation of their consciousness, which is like the annihilation of their being. There's something in the spirit that we are, the beingness that we are, which wants to persist in beingness forever, and in fact does. But we lose the realization along the way that that actually does happen. Well, through meditative techniques and through practice, And through increasingly informing the mind through study, we have a more flexible and intelligent attitude towards this kind of process. And we can even practice these things while still, in a way, electrically, magnetically attached to the physical body. But considering ourselves and experiencing ourselves as a unit of consciousness, a unit of being consciousness, is very necessary and will reduce the fear when one can come and go onto the astral plane from the body, when one recognizes one's separability from the body, then at least one lives in the hope that death is very much like that. You're conscious in one place at one moment and in another moment, conscious elsewhere and of other things. Maybe people in this group have had that experience, and it certainly shows that consciousness is not annihilated when one suspects otherwise that it might be. It just isn't. And so finally, DK says, there is no death. Death for the average man is the cataclysmic end involving the termination of all human relations, the cessation of all physical activity, the severing of all signs of love and affection, and the passage, unwilling and protesting, into the unknown and the dreaded. What was it? Dylan Thomas was writing about the death of his father, and he said, do not go gently into that, what kind of night, good night. Good night, wasn't it? And that was interesting because then he's saying good night at the same time to his dying father, and maybe he has no belief in the extension of consciousness. Do not go gently into that good night. Rage against the dying of the light. Well, it's dramatic. And for those who are in that state, it's very poignant. But is it true? That's the question. So death for the average man is the cataclysmic end involving the termination of all human relations. Maybe we fear that the most, or one of the most fearful possibilities. The cessation of all physical activity, though others will replace it. The severing of all signs of love and affection, and the passage, unwilling and protesting, into the unknown and dreaded. It is analogous to leaving a lighted and a warmed room, friendly and familiar, where our loved ones are assembled. One can almost think of the deathbed scene, and going out into the cold and dark night, alone and terror-stricken, hoping for the best and sure of nothing. What a magnificent description, analogy. So this can only be written by one who knows the matter deeply. Into the dark night, and into finally, annihilation, really. And that is also the great hope that of some that to die perchance to dream. There's the rub. It's in Hamlet, and the dreading of the dreaming. The soul can go to hell. The soul can have a terrible time. Or others just hope there will be annihilation and yet protest against the annihilation of being. But people are apt to forget that every night in the hours of sleep we die to the physical plane and are alive and functioning elsewhere, even though, what can we say, even though the brain may not record. and usually does not record this functioning. So already, a sensitization of the brain to record the functioning will give much assurance about an elsewhere in which we participate. Some people say, well, it's, so connected to the brain that without the brain, you wouldn't have those experiences. But the occultist says something quite opposite to that. They forget that they have already achieved facility in leaving the physical body because they cannot as yet bring back into the physical brain consciousness the recollection of that passing out and of the subsequent interval of active living. They fail to relate death and sleep. I once gave some material of this nature to a friend, and when he came to the section which seemed to put an equivalence between death and sleep, he rebelled, he protested, he no longer listened, he no longer read, he threw up his hands. This was too radical a thought. Sleep, of course, was so familiar, and death so unfamiliar. How can these be related, he thought. Well, anyway, we have to sensitize the brain, don't we? Death, after all, is only a longer interval in the life of physical plane functioning. One has only gone abroad for a longer period. But the process of daily sleep and the process of occasional dying are identical, with the one difference that in sleep the magnetic thread, or current of energy along which the life force streams, is preserved intact and constitutes the path of return to the body, and in death this life thread is broken or snapped. When this has happened, the conscious entity cannot return to the dense physical body, and that body, lacking the principle of coherence, then disintegrates. Well, to the readers of the Tibetan's material, these sentences and paragraphs, I think, are quite familiar, but we have to really take them in. Daily sleep and occasional dying. Okay, that's sort of the proportion. You sleep every night, and let's say every 70 years you die. And it's all about electricity and magnetic currents, whether one comes and goes with ease or whether one cannot return because the magnetic current, the thread, the sutratma, the life thread, is in its connection with the dense physical body, snapped, broken or snapped. When this is happening, the body will begin to disintegrate and there is no return. You kind of wonder, occasionally people are pronounced dead and then they wake up in the middle of the funeral service or someplace else. I guess the magnetic thread has not been snapped in those cases. It should be remembered that the purpose and the will of the soul, the spiritual determination to be and to do, utilizes the thread soul, the sutratma, the life current, as its means of expression in form. The body has to be alive in a coherent way, with a coherent life sustaining it, and not fulfilling the old statement that the body is never more alive than when it's dead, meaning that each of the little constituents goes its own way and is unsustained by the life current which causes the coherence and sustainment of those little lives. This life current differentiates into two currents or two threads, when it reaches the body and is anchored, if I might so express it, in two locations. And that's probably, the head and the heart. This is symbolic of the aspect, symbolic of the differentiations of Atma, or spirit. Now, oftentimes it's called the Atman, and Atma means spiritual will, but okay, we're talking about the spirit, into its two reflections, soul and body. So the monad is spirit and differentiates into soul and body. And the soul sustains the body with its differentiations, with the greater amount of power that is given to it than to a personality. The soul, which is an extension of the monad, generates the body or personality. The soul or consciousness aspect, that which makes a human being a rational, thinking entity, is anchored by one aspect of the thread soul to the seat in the brain, found in the region of the pineal gland. The other aspect of the life which animates every atom of the body and which constitutes the principle of coherence or of integration finds its way to the heart and is focused or anchored there. And finds its way is not a desultory phrase. It probably gives us a hint about the construction process. So, from the monad, from the spirit, two threads go forth, and one, the thread that animates the soul, is anchored in the brain, and the other aspect of life, which is animating the personality, is anchored in the heart center. All right, there's a dual thread, and we know that it's possible to be, in a way, brain dead, and the thread from the brain is withdrawn, but the heart keeps beating. The soul is the consciousness aspect, that which makes a human being a rational, thinking entity, is anchored by one aspect of this thread soul. Thread soul, or, it's being called here, let's keep these terms straight, it's being called here the Sutra Atma, to a seat in the brain found in the region of the pineal gland. I think Descartes felt or thought that the seat of the soul was the pineal gland, and I think at that early time he was correct. The other aspect of the life thread, really, we're calling it that, which animates every atom of the body and which constitutes the principle of coherence or of integration. The heart is an integrating mechanism, finds its way to the heart and is anchored there. From these 2 points, the spiritual man seeks to control the mechanism. So the spirit has its anchors in the etheric and physical body. But one of the, I think maybe it is that both of these threads pass through the soul, and perhaps that is the case. The life is in the heart and the consciousness is in the brain. Thus, functioning on the physical plane becomes possible, and objective existence becomes a temporary mode of expression. The soul seated in the brain makes man an intelligent, rational entity, self-conscious and directing. He is aware of varying degree of the world in which he lives, according to the point of evolution and the consequent development of the mechanism. That mechanism is triple in expression. There are first of all the nadis and the 7 centers of force, then the nervous system in its 3 divisions, cerebrospinal, sympathetic, and peripheral. I guess parasympathetic should be added here, although maybe that's what's meant by peripheral, but I don't think so. And then there is the endocrine system, which might be regarded as the densest aspect or externalization of the other 2. And this theme is developed. This theme is developed in esoteric healing. So, how do we function on the outer plane? These 2 threads. The sort of the Sutratma, which differentiates into a consciousness thread and a continuing, sustaining life thread. The life current is sustaining all, but consciousness is anchored in the etheric brain, and then finally the physical brain in the region of the pineal gland. So soul is seated in the brain, and we become self-directing, and then there's a triple instrument, and we call it then the etheric part of nadis and chakras. Then the nervous system, and somewhere in here the blood stream or blood network should be mentioned, and the finally the endocrine system, which feeds the blood stream with its secretions. Well, we're aware of these 3, and control and sustainment is occurring from a higher level. Now, there's more to it. The soul seated in the heart is the life principle. I mean, if we call this thread soul. The principle of self-determination, the central nucleus of positive energy, by means of which all the atoms of the body are held in their right place and subordinated to the will to be of the soul, this soul being an extension of the monad or spirit. The principle of life, and here it comes, utilizes the bloodstream as its mode of expression and as its controlling agency. And through the close relation of the endocrine system to the bloodstream, we have the 2 aspects of soul activity brought together in order to make man a living, conscious, functioning entity governed by the soul, expressing the purpose of the soul in all activities of daily living. So what seems to be the case, the Sutratma must pass in its dual mode through the soul, and from the soul the thread continues and anchors in two places with two different functions. Okay, all of this is keeping us as the objective human being. The soul, seated in the heart, is the life principle, but it does come from the spirit, right? But this thread comes originally from the spirit. Really, the monad is the life. Death, therefore, is literally the withdrawal from the heart and from the head of these two streams of energy, producing consequently complete loss of consciousness and disintegration of the body. So here we have death defined as a withdrawal of threads, of energy threads. Death, therefore, is literally the withdrawal of from the heart and from the head of what's called, once they differentiate from the soul, the consciousness thread and the life thread. These two streams of energy called at this point the consciousness thread and the life thread, producing consequently complete loss of consciousness, let's just say as mediated by the senses associated with the body, and then the disintegration of the body not long afterwards. Death differs from sleep in that both streams of energy are withdrawn. Both are withdrawn. In sleep, only one thread of energy, which is anchored in the brain, is withdrawn, and when this happens, the man becomes unconscious in the area from which the thread is withdrawn, but conscious elsewhere. Okay, and let's get that spelled correctly. Okay, so this is a very important distinction, and do we balk at learning this differentiation? It seems some people are quite determined to have their consciousness annihilated forever. Death differs from sleep in that both streams of energy are withdrawn. In sleep, only the thread of energy which is anchored in the brain is withdrawn, and when this happens, the man becomes unconscious. By this we mean that his consciousness or sense of awareness is focused elsewhere. His attention is no longer directed towards things tangible and physical, but is turned upon another world of being, another vibratory level, we might say, and becomes centered in another apparatus or mechanism, in this case, the astral body. In death, both the threads are withdrawn or unified in the life thread, and here unified, or we might say reunified, because there was a differentiation as that life thread went forth. Vitality ceases to penetrate through the medium of the bloodstream, and the heart fails to function, just as the brain fails to record, and thus silence settles down, the house is empty. Well, he is repeating, the same thing, and driving the point home. Okay. Activity ceases except that amazing and immediate activity, which is the prerogative of matter itself and which expresses itself in the process of decomposition. Again, the body is never more alive than when it's dead, as it is said. So a coherent activity ceases. And it's immediate that the constituents of the body sort of take over and begin their process of independence from a coordinating and cohering stream of energy. From certain aspects, therefore, that process indicates man's unity with everything that is material. It demonstrates that he is part of nature itself. And let's say nature considered as material. And by nature, we mean the body of the one in whom we live and move and have our being. Yes, so I said that before, and you know, the lower 18 subplanes are nature, because that's the dense physical body of the one in whom we live and move and have our being, namely the planetary logos. In those three worlds, living, moving, and being, living, moving, and being, we have the entire story. Being is awareness, self-consciousness, and self-expression. And of this, a man's head and brain are the exoteric symbols. Living is energy, desire and form, coherence and adhesion to an idea, and of this, the heart and the blood are the exoteric symbols, and moving indicates the integration and response of the existing aware living entity into the universal activity, and of this, the stomach and pancreas and the liver are the symbols. This is very important sentence. Well, it's more than one sentence, but it's a very important process that is here indicated, and it goes through the rays. There is a sequence here of the first, second, and third rays, with the stomach, pancreas, liver indicating the third ray, and the livingness, the energy of desire and form and coherence and adhesion indicating the second ray, and being indicating the first ray. Now, there's a way in which we can also look at the anchor in the brain and the anchor in the heart as reversed, with the life or livingness being in the heart, the first ray being in the heart, and the second ray of consciousness being in the brain. It is interesting, though incidental to our subject, to bear in mind that in cases of imbecility and idiocy, and in that stage of old age which we call senile decay, the thread which is anchored in the brain is withdrawn. So, you know, when we're studying senility and Alzheimer's, and that Alzheimer's disease has become so much in the current thought, we're dealing with some subtle causes. A lot of research is being done on causes which are material, whilst that which conveys the life impulse or urge remains still anchored in the heart. So the life, um, the life of the body persists, but the consciousness is compromised. Okay. There is life, but no intelligent awareness. Now, maybe, okay, compromised. And we would say that maybe then we should consider life as the first aspect and consciousness as the second, and thus the second aspect is withdrawn. Well, those of us who are getting older maybe feel our faculties slipping a little bit, but hopefully in our conversations there remains a consciousness thread which can contribute to intelligent awareness. We are at the point now where 1 hour has passed. I'll just indicate that. Okay, 1 hour has passed. There is life, but no intelligent awareness. There is movement, but no intelligent direction. And in the case of senile decay, where there has been a high-grade apparatus utilized in life, there may be the appearance of intelligent functioning, but that is an illusion due to old habit and to old established rhythm, but not the coordinated, coherent purpose. And this is most interesting. An appearance of intelligence and of the presence of an intelligent consciousness, but not really. It doesn't really occur. And just habit fools the people who look on, and they think the onlooker thinks the formerly intelligent entity is really at home, but no. All right. It must also be noted that death is therefore undertaken at the direction of the ego. He does make it a small e, but we think of it as not the ego as it is used in psychology, meaning the sense of personality, but the ego as it is meant, or as it designates the soul nature of man in the causal body in the egoic lotus. It's undertaken at the direction of the ego, no matter how unaware a human being may be of that direction. So on the higher levels, on the higher mental plane, the word of death is sounded, and there is a dissociation of the son and the mother that is intended. It's in the very last rule of esoteric healing. Let's see, esoteric healing. I'm not sure that in the very beginning of the book we're going to find it. No, we're not going to find it that way. Son, mother, form, purpose. Those are the words, and here it is, hearken, O Chela, to the call. Well, this is a Chela, not ordinary human being, having advanced further. Hearken, O Chela, to the call which comes from the son to the mother, and then obey. You are the disciple between the two, right? The word goes forth that form has served its purpose. The principle of mind then organizes itself and then repeats the word. The waiting form responds and drops away. The soul stands free. This is the first part of Law 10, and the second part liberates the monad. So, there's a sound, a word of death, which goes forth and then is taken up and reverberates through the lower system. So it's undertaken at the direction of the ego. Now, I guess DK sometimes talks about accidental deaths or deaths that occur under world karma or group karma, but so often the ego decides. And I guess the term of duration in physical form can be extended or reduced according to the wisdom of the ego and the direction being followed by the soul incarnation within the dense form. So it's undertaken at the direction of the ego, no matter how unaware a human being may be of that direction. The process works automatically with the majority, for when the soul withdraws its attention, the inevitable reaction on the physical plane is death, either by the abstraction of one of the dual threads of life and reason energy, or by the abstraction of the thread of energy which is qualified by mentality, leaving the life stream still functioning through the heart but no intelligent awareness. The soul is engaged elsewhere and occupied on its own plane with its own affairs. The soul loses interest. So, for the average person, when the soul withdraws its attention, the inevitable reaction on the physical plane is death. Okay. Either by the abstraction of the dual threads of life and reason, both perhaps, or by the often sad lingering of the physical form while the thread of consciousness is withdrawn. So either by the withdrawal of both threads at once, or by the withdrawal at first of the consciousness thread. In the case of the highly developed human beings, we often find a sense of prevision as to the death period. And this is incident upon egoic contact and awareness of the wishes of the ego. Let's just say the awareness of the decision of the solar angel. It involves sometimes a knowledge of the very day of death. I'm remembering, forgive me, it's always movies here. I guess I have a prominent Neptune which takes me to the movies. Fewer than you might think, but there was a wonderful movie. Was it a Belgian movie, I think? And it was called Antonia's Line, and sort of begins with a woman who has gone through much in her life, saying, "Today is a good day to die." I guess the Indian braves at the Little Bighorn also said the same, but for a different reason. She simply intended to die by the end of the day, and she did. And then in the movie, her life was reviewed, and it was a wonderful story. but it involves sometimes a knowledge of the very day of death, coupled to a preservation of self-determination up to the final moment of withdrawal. And then you have to give yourself over to the process. Also in the movie The Little Buddha, the elderly monk who was sort of directing the entire process of finding the next incarnation of the great teacher, maybe the Dalai Lama, and found instead 3 who were each holding an aspect of it. Interesting. He decided when to die, and he went through the process that the Tibetans know, so he was able, by the time morning had come, to make his conscious exit, sitting there meditating. So sometimes one knows the wishes of the ego and even the very day of death, and keeps the coherence of one's consciousness until the very end. In the case of initiates, there is much more than this. There is an intelligent understanding of the laws of abstraction, and this enables the one who is making the transition to withdraw consciously and in full waking awareness out of the physical body, and so, I guess, immediately to function on the astral plane. And this involves the preservation of continuity of consciousness so that no hiatus occurs between the sense of awareness on the physical plane and the after-death state. That's important for the initiate, right? For others, they awaken in the new place, perhaps a few moments later, or maybe sometime later, but there is an awakening in the new environment. The man knows himself to be as he was before, though without an apparatus whereby he can contact the physical plane. He remains aware of the states of feeling and of thoughts of those he loves, though he cannot perceive or contact the dense physical vehicle. All of this is so important and, in general, reassuring to many for whom the ancient dread, the ancient terror still exists. He remains aware of the status of the states of feeling and of the thoughts of those he loves, though he cannot perceive or contact the dense physical vehicle. He can communicate with them on the astral plane or telepathically through the mind if they and he are en rapport, but communication that involves the use of the 5 physical senses of perception lies necessarily out of his reach. So, can there be then communication in the dream state of the still alive individual? It is useful to remember, however, that astrally and mentally the interplay can be closer and more sensitive than ever before, for he is freed from the handicap of the physical body. 2 things, however, militate against this interplay. One is the grief and violent emotional upset of those left behind, and in the case of the average human being, the other is the man's own ignorance and bewilderment as he stands faced by what are to him new conditions, though they are really old conditions if he could but realize it. Once men have lost the fear of death and have established an understanding of the after-death world, which is not based on hallucination and hysteria, or on the conclusions, oft unintelligent, of the average medium, who speaks under the control of his own thought form built by himself and the circle of sitters, we shall have the process of death properly controlled. The condition of those left behind will be carefully handled so that there is no loss of relationship and no false expenditure of energy. Well, this should be reassuring to some. Okay. I feel like sending this forward to some people who need it, you know. This is the entire story, right? Well, there is some real instruction here, and people need to learn how to die and to die well. And there's a video now appearing along those lines, probably a number of videos appearing along these lines that help to instruct humanity about the process. There is a big difference now between the scientific method of bringing people into incarnation and the perfectly blind and oft frightened and surely ignorant way in which we usher them out of incarnation. And that's so true. I mean, their life and form is regarded as of great value. And the very fear of the process of departure and the departure to parts unknown has prevented the necessary research, but it will come, that will help usher people into a clearer understanding of the process of departure and of the worlds into which departure occurs. I seek today to open the door in the Occident to a newer and more scientific method of handling the process of dying, and let me make myself perfectly clear. What I have to say in no way abrogates modern medical science with its palliatives and skill. All I plead for is a sane approach to death. All I seek to make is a suggestion that when pain has worn itself out and weakness has supervened, the dying person be permitted to prepare himself, even if apparently unconscious. That's apparently unconscious, because he tells us that the dying person can be very conscious, though without the slightest ability to move or to expend the will to move. For the great transition, forget not that it takes strength and a strong hold on the nervous apparatus to produce pain. Is it impossible to conceive of a time when the act of dying will be a triumphant finale of life? Is it impossible to vision the time when the hours spent on the deathbed may be but a glorious prelude to a conscious exit, when the fact that the man is to discard the handicap of the physical sheath may be for him and those around him the long waited for and joyous consummation? He puts it in such positive terms, doesn't he? Can you not visualize the time when, instead of tears and fear and the refusal to recognize the inevitable, the dying person and his friends would mutually agree on the hour, and that nothing but happiness would characterize the passing? Can we not visualize this? That in the minds of those left behind, the thought of sorrow will not enter, and deathbeds will be recognized as happier occasions than births and marriages. I tell you that before so very long, this will be deeply so for the intelligent of the race, and little by little for all. What a uplifting and really inspiring view of the death process. Wonderful, really. Okay, going on. You say there are as yet only beliefs as to immortality and no sure evidences. In the accumulation of testimony, in the inner assurances of the human heart, in the fact of belief in eternal persistence as an idea of men, lies sure indication. But indication will give place to conviction and knowledge before another 100 years has elapsed, for an event will take place and a revelation be given to the race which will turn hope into certainty and belief into knowledge. Well, that 100 years is almost past with respect to the writing of this section of the White Magic Book. The Tibetan offers certain prophecies, and some of them seem to occur in a timely manner, and others have to be deferred, it seems. In the meantime, a new attitude to death, let a new attitude to death be cultivated, and a new science of death be inaugurated, one to equal in quality, let us say. Okay. One to equal in quality the science of birth. Let it cease to be the one thing we cannot control and which inevitably defeats us, and let us begin to control our passing over to the other side, and so understand somewhat the technique of transition. Well, this is happening, and there have appeared real, intelligent, and persistent, and sensitive death researchers. They are working on the subject, and they have many documented stories from those who have died technically and then returned. I suppose, you know, the life thread was not entirely snapped, but the breathing had stopped and the heart had stopped beating, and, you know, the so-called near-death experience had occurred. They were clinically dead, and they returned, and they tell some interesting stories, many, many similar. So, before I take up this subject in greater detail, I would like to make reference to the web in the brain, which is intact for the majority, but is non-existent for the illumined seer. The etheric web in the brain and the wearing through this web through various processes, allowing in evidence and sight of subtle realms. In the human body, as you know, we have an underlying interpenetrating vital body, which is the counterpart of the physical, which is larger than the physical, and which we call the etheric body or double. It is an energy body and is composed of force centers and nadis or force threads. These underlie or are the counterparts of the nervous apparatus, the nerves, and the nerve ganglia. Right, that's a central tenet in occultism. This is part of our constitution, occultism states. In 2 places in the human vital body, there are orifices of exit for the life force. One opening is the solar plexus, and the other is in the brain at the top of the head. Protecting both is a closely woven web of etheric matter composed of interlacing strands of life energy. And I think there's also an exit possible in the heart. I myself once experienced that. I had been reading these things and trying to go to sleep consciously. Of course, it's the surest way of keeping yourself up all night. But it felt to me that under the circumstances, there was a heart exit on that particular night. I'd much rather go through the head and hope I do, but I observed some kind of emergence through something that was not the solar plexus and not the head. During the process of death, the pressure of the life energy beating against the web produces eventually a puncturing or an opening. Okay, and and maybe this is one of the reasons why, perhaps, okay, perhaps this is one of the reasons for the peculiar reanimation of the dying person just before death. The energy has to be quite strong to break through this etheric web, and that inflow of energy from wherever it comes gives an increase of the pressure so that there can be the puncturing of which the Tibetan speaks. Out of this, the life force pours as the potency of the abstracting influence of the soul increases. And here, in a way, increases, okay, we might say, no, that's not it. There we go. The second ray energy of Jupiter attracts. So, not only pressure to escape, but attraction from within. Okay, I'm just trying to see, hopefully. No, it's happened again. My chronometer has fooled me. It reaches a certain point of 100% and then wipes away the timing, unfortunately. Anyway, I intend to finish this whichever way it goes. So out of this puncture, right, the life force pours as the potency of the abstracting influence of the soul increases. In the case of animals, of infants, and of men and women who are polarized entirely in the physical and astral bodies, the door of exit is the solar plexus, and it is that web which is punctured, thus permitting the passing out. In the case of mental types of the more highly evolved human units, it is the web at the top of the head in the region of the fontanelle, which is ruptured, thus again permitting the exit of the thinking, rational being. And I think he will describe also that intermediate heart exit. In psychics, and in the case of mediums and lower seers, clairvoyant and clairaudient people, the solar plexus web is permanently ruptured early in life, and easily, therefore, they pass in and out of the body, going into a trance, as it is called, and functioning on the astral plane. So this is a Neptunian phenomenon. But for these types, there is no continuity of consciousness, and there seems no relation between their physical plane existence and the happenings which they relate whilst in a trance, and of which they usually remain totally unaware in the waking consciousness. You wonder what else may be speaking through them, using their vehicle. The whole performance is below the diaphragm and is related primarily to animal sentient life. In the case of conscious clairvoyance and in the work of the higher psychics and seers, there is no trance, obsession, and mediumship. Not in the usual unconscious sense, not in the sense of, he distinguishes between the mediums that are governed by Pisces and Cancer, and those more conscious mediums governed by Virgo. In all of them, the planet Neptune has its strength. It is the web in the brain which is punctured, and the opening in that region permits the inflow of light, information, and inspiration. It confers also the power to pass into the state of samadhi, which is the spiritual correspondence to the trance condition of the animal nature. And this is a very high objective. Of the questing consciousness. It's considered, the result, the reward of much meditation and spiritual living, and occasionally you do see a photograph, maybe also a video, but at least I've seen photographs of great teachers who were in the state of samadhi. There's one of, it's not Vivekananda. In fact, it is Ramakrishna, who was the teacher of Vivekananda, and you see him being in bliss, let us say, in the state of samadhi and supported by his students. I mean, I think, he could not control the physical body or really stand up in it, although he's in a very, very high state, obviously. So samadhi is like a process of death, but it's an entrance into very, very full livingness. In the process of death, these are therefore the two main exits: the solar plexus for the astrally polarized, physically biased human being, and therefore the vast majority, and the head center for the mentally polarized and spiritually oriented human being. Now, in some point, he does mention that intermediate heart center. I think I stayed awake hours, watchfully, following his instructions. And then came an exit. So this is the first and most important fact to remember, and it will be easily seen how the trend of a life tendency and the focus of the life attention determines the mode of exit at death. Okay. It can also be seen that an effort to control the astral life and the emotional nature, and to orient oneself to the mental world and to spiritual things, has a momentous effect upon the phenomenal aspects of the death process. We can say, the one with the controlled astral body will most likely exit through the top of the head. If the student is thinking clearly, it will be apparent to him that one exit concerns the spiritual and highly evolved man, whilst the other concerns the low-grade human being who has scarcely advanced beyond the animal stage. What then of the average man? And here it comes. A third exit is now in temporary use just below the apex of the heart. Another etheric web is found, covering an orifice of exit. So that night, that's what I seemed to experience. I cannot be sure, but it seemed to be the case. And then, sure enough, there was another environment waiting on the other side. There was a continuity. And so I guess at first it is a little difficult to practice this nightly exit because you may, if you're a very busy person, you may at first lose a lot of sleep. But I imagine it becomes a practiced process and can be performed at will later on. The exit in the head, we have therefore the following situation. The exit in the head used by the intellectual type by disciples and initiates in the world. The exit in the heart used by the kindly, well-meaning man or woman who is a good citizen, an intelligent friend, and a philanthropic worker. And number 3, the exit in the region of the solar plexus, used by the emotional, unintelligent, unthinking man, and by those whose animal nature is strong. So this is quite clearly laid out. And we can, there's an old Greek saying that all of life is a learning how to die. And it seems a little vague and abstract, but perhaps it refers to practices of this nature, where we can, in fact, learn to make a conscious, continuous exit, which we can perform upon the deathbed or maybe in the circumstance in which death is undertaken. This is the first point in the new information which will slowly become common knowledge in the West during the next century. And now, we are in that century. Much of it is already known by thinkers in the East and is in the nature of a first step towards a rational understanding of the death process. And that, of course, will banish the ancient terror, the fear of the unknown, and will bring science into the death process, which is already the case. He gives us advice, about the death chamber and the quiet that is required in the use of orange light and sandalwood incense. He gives us all of those indications. The second point to be grasped, okay, so second point, and let's go back to something that we might call the first point. Okay. Let's call this the first point here. So now the second point to be grasped is the following, is that there can be a technique of dying and a training given during life which will lead up to the utilization of that technique. And we have seen books from the East appearing, mostly written by Tibetans, I guess, at this time. Well, there's, of course, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but there's a book called the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, and I think there are a number such books. As regards the training to which a man can submit himself, I will give a few hints which will be found to convey a new meaning to much work now being done by all aspirants. Okay, the elder brothers of the race who have guided humanity, through long centuries are now busy preparing people for the next great step to be taken. This step will bring in a continuity of consciousness which will do away with all fear of death and link the physical and astral planes in such close relation that they will in reality constitute one plane, and not in a terrifying manner either. There's some things in the book of Revelation which make you think that the hell worlds are about to precipitate onto the physical worlds, the lower levels of the astral plane. Maybe this is the case with some people channeling, as it were, those worlds. But this is the different process we're talking about. Just as an at-one-ment has to be brought about between the various aspects of man, so a similar unification has to take place in connection with the various aspects of planetary life. So we might say two planes united. The planes have to be at one as well as soul and body, and this has already been largely accomplished between the etheric plane and the dense physical plane. Now it is rapidly carried forward between the physical and astral, and there is, he tells us elsewhere, there is a specific group which is undertaking this unification. Okay, then let us continue. It is the work being done by seekers in all departments of human thought and life. In the work being done by all of them, this unification is proceeding, and in the training now suggested to earnest and sincere aspirants, there are other objectives than just the one of producing soul and body at one-ment. And we might say that through various groups, this training can proceed. Somewhere DK, maybe it's in externalization of the hierarchy. Also in Dina 1, Discipleship in the New Age 1, he deals with the work of specialized groups. So we're trying to unite here the physical and the astral, and it's being carried forward, and there is a specific group whose task it is to find the best techniques of doing so. No emphasis, however, is laid upon them, owing to the ability of man unduly to emphasize the wrong objectives. So if we overemphasize these training groups, wrong objectives can be pursued. It might well be asked if it is possible to give a simple set of rules that would be followed now by all who seek to establish such a rhythm that life itself is not only organized and constructive, but when the moment for vacating the outer sheath arrives, there will be no problem nor difficulty. Okay, a constructive life and a death which is not problematic or difficult. I will therefore give you 4 simple rules that link up with much that all students are now doing. 4 rules. For an constructive life and the right kind of death. All right, number one, learn to keep focused in the head through visualization and meditation and through the steady practice of concentration. So, the mind and the upper areas of the astral body are being utilized, imagination, and it is under the control of the mind. It's different than just letting the imagination go. It is controlled by mental objectives. So keep focused in the head. This is one of the rules to help with the dying process and also, of course, with the living process. The steady practice of concentration. Develop the capacity to live increasingly as the king seated on the throne between the eyebrows. Basically, the Kundalini rises and then returns over the top of the head to the Asana center. The return of the Kundalini to the Asana center after rising to the highest head center. This is a rule that can be applied to everyday affairs of life. Talk about the practicality of this book, right? It seems to be getting increasingly occultly practical as we go. Okay, I'm trying to get a little more light on the situation here. Learn to render heart service and not an emotional insistence on activity directed towards handling the affairs of others. Sometimes you just have to laugh, The busybody who gets emotional satisfaction out of running your life for you and calls it service, okay? Rendering heart service, which does release the person toward whom the service is directed. The heart releases, the soul releases, but the solar plexus does not. It remains very attached. This involves, prior to all such activity, the answering of two questions. Am I rendering this service to an individual as an individual, or am I rendering it as a member of a group to a group? And is my motive an egoic impulse, or am I prompted by emotion, ambition to shine, and love of being loved or admired? Well, not much is going to escape the Tibetan's gaze, and it should not escape our gaze either, as we learn what we're really doing, and not just imagine that we're doing something when we're really doing something else. So let's just pause for a moment. Think of your service. Am I rendering this service to an individual as an individual? Or am I rendering it as a member of a group to a group? Just think. Of course, this can take a while, and there's so many questions we can ask ourselves, which are born of things that are stated in this book, but also DK himself poses the questions, and we can simply address ourselves to them. We find questions in the reappearance of the Christ meditation. We find questions for us in the attracting of money for hierarchical work. So we have to know when we should stop and pause and reflect. And regarding that service that we may be performing, is my motive an egoic impulse, or am I prompted by emotion, ambition to shine, or the love of being loved or admired. Well, a sincere review of questions of this nature will clarify the consciousness. These two activities will result in the focusing of the life energies above the diaphragm and so negate the attractive power of the solar plexus. So basically, we're talking about focusing in the head and serving with the heart. This is what we are addressing in these first 2 points, focusing our consciousness usually in the head and serving through the heart and not the solar plexus. Hence, that center, solar plexus, will become increasingly inactive, and there will not be so much danger of puncturing the web in that locality, we might say, and therefore exiting onto the lower levels of the astral plane. Okay, now this is an important one. Number 3, learn as you go to sleep to withdraw the consciousness to the head. This should be practiced as a definite exercise as one falls asleep. I thought, well, let's see, does he mention this kind of approach twice? Once in the Here in White Magic and maybe in the Dyna books, or did I get it wrong? Anyway, practice this. One should not permit oneself to drift off to sleep, but should endeavor to preserve the consciousness intact until there is a conscious passing out onto the astral plane. Relaxation, close attention, and a steady drawing upward to the center in the head should be attempted for until the aspirant has learned to be steadily aware of all processes in going to sleep and to preserve at the same time his positivity. There is danger in this work. The first steps must be taken with intelligence and followed for many years until facility in the work of abstraction is achieved. Well, right there is a little nightly curriculum laid out for us, and the warning that it takes years to really perfect it. I think elsewhere there's further description of all this, and it tells you the kind of phenomena you're likely to encounter, etheric phenomena, and so forth. Well, and maybe it's here. So, learning to fall asleep, should we say, consciously, and at least by withdrawing the consciousness into the head at first. Number 4. Let's see. What are we doing here? Right. For the constructive life and preparing for the right kind of death. Focus in the head, serving in the heart, falling asleep consciously. Number 4, record and watch all phenomena connected with the withdrawing process. I don't think that one should necessarily jump out of bed at that moment and start writing. because we're trying something else. So if we're always disturbing ourselves, we cannot be successful. Record and watch all phenomena connected with the withdrawing process, whether followed in the meditation work or in going to sleep. So, in the meditation work, abstraction is also possible. It will be found, for instance, that many people wake with an almost painful start, just as they have dropped asleep. This is due to the slipping out of the consciousness through the web, which is not adequately clear, and through an orifice which is partly closed. And let's call this, this is the familiar jolt experienced. Others may hear an intensely loud snap in the region of the head. This is caused by the vital airs in the head, of which we are not usually aware, and is produced by an inner aural, A-U-R-A-L, having to do, I think, with hearing, aural sensitivity, which causes awareness of sounds, always present but not usually registered. Others will see, so, will it be phenomena through the ear, phenomena through the eye? Others will see light as they fall asleep, or clouds of color, or banners and streamers of violet, all of which are etheric phenomena. These phenomena, which are of no real moment, are all related to the vital body, to pranic emanations, and to the web of light. So be sensitive as you are falling asleep to various colors, forms, sounds. Okay. So keep your attentiveness keen. I just want to see that word. Okay, here's sensitive. Let's get that straightened out. I want to see if this is going to be found in other places. Like if I look at the word streamers, does it occur but once? Because if it does, it's only here that we will discover what to do about living the constructive life and preparing for death. Streamers has two. And so the first one is in a treatise on white magic. And, well, the next one is also in a treatise on white magic. So I think I was incorrect. It's looking like I was incorrect regarding this section being found in Discipleship in the New Age, Volume 2. I guess I read it in a treatise on white magic. On carrying on of this practice and the following of these 4 rules over a period of years will do much. The carrying on will do much to facilitate the technique of the deathbed. For the man who has learned to handle his body as he falls asleep has an advantage over the man who never pays any attention to the process. And of course, this is what I remember, and I see it is a white magic entry. Okay, so are you ready to do that tonight? And for the next number of years? Or does one just drop in bed so entirely exhausted that all one wants to do is just drift off unconsciously with no real continuity? All right, he's given us a practice. It seems that if we follow his instructions, we'll always be practicing something, won't we? Okay. Now, in relation to the technique of dying, it is only possible for me at this time to make one or two suggestions. I deal not here with the attitude of the attendant watchers. I deal only with those points which will make for an easier passing over of the transient soul, the soul that's on its way to a more subtle environment. And I suppose if this happens a few times, and if it is registered with foolish consciousness, not just the consciousness we kind of recognize as being dream consciousness, then we realize we are participating in a very real and oft repeated process, and that the fearing of death cannot be sustained by people who really think about this process. So, first, let there be silence in the chamber of the departing one. This is, of course, frequently the case. It must be remembered that the dying person may usually be unconscious. This unconsciousness is apparent, but not real, and that's so utterly important. We can have no idea in our present state of what the degree of attentiveness may be for such a person, but although attentive, there is no ability to really move or speak. There comes that kind of coma where there is apparently alertness, but not the power to show signs of engagement, except the heart does keep beating. In 900 cases out of 1,000, 9 out of 10, the brain awareness is there with a full consciousness of happenings, but there is a complete paralysis of the will and a complete inability to generate the energy which will indicate aliveness. So this is, I'm sure, at the present moment, distressing for those in the chamber of death, the apparent lack of communication, but one must act as if the communication can really be there, even though response through any movement or normal sign of life will not be there. A complete inability to generate the energy which will indicate aliveness. When silence and understanding rule the sick room, the departing soul can hold possession of its instrument with clarity until the last minute and can make due preparation. And we have to, even though there is nothing that shows aliveness except maybe the beating heart, we have to realize that indeed the aliveness is present. And this will mean the educating of those who are in the chamber of death as well, will it not? Later, let me check about sandalwood. It's really looking like this whole section, I had estimated it was in a different book. But let's see. Sandal, how do you spell it? 3 times. All right, here's a symbol in esoteric psychology. Here's sandalwood in esoteric healing. Okay, there it is. And here is sandalwood in white magic. And it looks like this is the same paragraph. So there, it's esoteric healing. There's a mixture of different and identical paragraphs in these 2 books. Esoteric healing covers the death process very extensively. Later, when more anent color is known, only orange lights will be permitted in the sick room of a dying person, and these will be installed with due ceremony when there is assuredly no possibility of recovery. Orange, well, orange is the color of the fifth ray, and the fifth ray, among other things, rules the law of cleavages. So we are in the process of separating the inner principles from the outer body, creating a cleavage between them. Also, orange has much to do with the mental plane, which is repeating the word of death, and with the soul, the basic color of the egoic lotus is orange, basic color. And it seems that the egoic lotus is also involved in this abstracting process. So only orange lights will be permitted in the sick room of the dying person. Orange aids in the focusing in the head. Well, you would expect that of fifth ray types, but also it is a first ray color, as given in the sort of appendix of Esoteric Psychology 1. Red may be the major color of the first ray, but orange is also involved, and we are dealing with a first ray process of abstraction. Orange aids the focusing in the head, just as red, even though a first ray color, but it's all in how we react to it now, stimulates the solar plexus, and green has a definite effect upon the heart and life streams. Well, we know vitality, regeneration of vitality is associated with green. We know that. And we also, what is this here? Yeah, that red has a Martian quality to it, but also is related to a very deep first ray, but the way people respond to it now is largely through the solar plexus, and that's one kind of response that we don't want to have in the death chamber. Certain types of music will be used when more in connection with sound is understood, but there is no music as yet which will facilitate the work of the soul in abstracting itself from the body, though certain notes on the organ will be found effective. And maybe the note D, it's a first ray note. The note C is a red note, and, will it be used in terms of Mars and the solar plexus, or will it be used more along the first ray line? I wonder, Bach has a, is it kind of, what is the name of it? It's a toccata and fugue, yeah, in the key of D. And maybe something like that will be used, but it's not very serene, but it's grand. There are stories, too, about some of the late quartets of Beethoven, one section particularly, which is associated with making a transition, but in this case it was a suicide, not a pleasant association, but one could understand how beautiful it is, and one could pass over with that. We'll learn more about it as we go, because he tells us that of the techniques of healing, and part of healing can be the release of the soul, the methods of color and sound will be among the first to be utilized, appreciated, and utilized. At the exact moment of death, if a person's own note is sounded, it will coordinate the two streams of energy and eventually rupture the life thread. But the knowledge of this is too dangerous to transmit yet and can only later be given. I would indicate the future and the lines along which future occult study will run, and maybe the new installment will hold further hints, maybe. But are we talking of the soul ray notes? If so, we might be able to make some estimates. But, well, you know, there is going to be an orange note. That orange note, again, is probably the D, but it's not necessarily the soul ray note of the individual. And he blinds that subject sufficiently so there can be no certainty. The use of sound prematurely can cause premature abstraction. So it depends on the motive and the context, and we have to be patient about this. But facilitation is needed, right? Facilitation of the deathbed process is needed and useful, or useful and needed. Okay, further. It will be found also that pressure on certain nerve centers and on certain arteries will facilitate the work. The science of dying is held in custody, as many people know, in Tibet, and we expect Tibet to be ruled partially by Scorpio, the sign of death. We had to, I think it was mentioned before, but there is an astrology operative here. Rays, astrology, colors, sounds, all of these things can assist. Pressure on the jugular vein and on certain big nerves in the region of the head and on a particular spot in the medulla oblongata will be found helpful and effective. I think that Navy SEALs know about this, but it is to take out their enemies, and it's not being used in the deathbed ritual and process. But a definite science of death will inevitably later be elaborated and making transition smooth and, as DK says, joyous, happy, a moment of consummation, but only when the fact of the soul is recognized and its relation to body has been scientifically demonstrated. So okay, let's see here. We then, we rely upon France. For this scientific demonstration. Now, interestingly, France has the Piscean soul along with the fifth ray. So Pisces is another of those signs of death ruled by Pluto and has to do with exit, vacating, leaving, escaping. And the scientific means of escaping very much can come under the combination of Pisces and the fifth ray. And Pisces has a lot of the first ray of Pluto in it as well, plus Neptune ruling Pisces as far as humanity is concerned in a special way. And Neptune is that planet which provides for the slipping out of form. Mantric phrases will also be employed and definitely built into the consciousness of the dying person by those around him, or employed deliberately and mentally by himself. I suppose the Tibetan technique, which found in the morning the the elderly teacher in this movie, The Little Buddha, um, that in that process he used mantra to facilitate a sure exit. The Christ demonstrated their use when he cried aloud, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." Now, was it the Christ? Was it the Buddha? Was it Jesus? He continues to blind things. So we don't know. Sometimes he does say the Christ when you think it simply has to be Jesus, and the other way around. Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And we have another instance in the words, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. So let's call these mantrams of release. The steady use of the sacred word chanted in an undertone or on a particular key to which the dying man will be found to respond. And again, I say, perhaps his soul ray note may later constitute also a part of the ritual of transition accompanied by the anointing with oil as preserved in the Catholic Church. And that anointing facilitates departure. But again, what kind of oil and when and why? Extreme unction has an occult scientific basis. Okay, the top of the head of the dying man should also symbolically point towards the east, and the feet and hands should be crossed. So maybe, there is no more possibility of flowing out. Oops, sorry. Okay. No more possibility of flowing out into the ordinary circumstances of life. One is self-contained, and one's only target or destination is withdrawal and not a re-engagement, at least at a certain point. Sandalwood only should be burned in the room, and no incense of any other kind permitted, for sandalwood is the incense of the first or destroyer ray, and the soul is in the process of destroying its habitation. So let us remember these things, and if we sense that death is imminent, or if we sense the approach at a certain time, let us instruct those responsible for it, for the management of the death chamber of these facts and factors. This is all that I can at this time communicate on the subject of death for the consideration of the general public. But I conjure all of you to push the study of death and its technique as far as possible, and to carry forward occult investigation of this matter. Well, he has certainly taken what looks like a scientific approach in explaining this to us. It makes a lot of sense, and it removes the horror, the terror from the whole subject. Okay. Now it's clear, friends, that we have reached the beginning of Rule 12, and we have come to page 508, and I think we began at 470 something. Let me go there and see what I can find. There is 492. So from 492 to 508, we have worked approximately 16 pages with the acting up of my chronometer, so I have no idea how long I've been going, but not as long as yesterday, I'm sure. And I will Yeah, here is our orienting part. So we're going from 11.6 to 12.1. And I have, as I say, I have no idea when this will take place because now a number of things have to be taken care of. And it will be commentary number 60. So what I'm going to send out to you is 59 programs, at least help you be aware of them so that if you really want to study this wonderful book, we can do that together. And you will come up with ideas that I have not entertained, and you will benefit from what occurs to you. 492 to 508 or 9. And we finish, this is the finishing of commentary 59, Rules for Magic on the Astral Plane. And soon, Rule 12 will come into our work, 12.1. And on some day in September, we really have not got so long to go in the completion of this book. There's approximately 110 pages left in the document. And the book itself, well, let's see. Let's go to the very end. We're on 492, and we finished this book on 639. So basically, it's about 140 pages left, maybe 148 or something of that nature. Maybe 150 pages remain in the actual white magic book, and about, since the pagination is different, about 110 pages of script using the pagination here of for the transference of the book onto computer pages. All right. Well, what to say? We've produced about 59 programs in this series. Some of them are longer, some are shorter, and most are 1 hour in duration. I don't know if you like to study this way, as if we are together in sort of a study group. And of course, in a study group, there would be, give and take, and you'd be speaking out and so forth. But you can use this in your own study groups when it comes to something, if you're patient, when it comes to something that is said and you want to respond to it, you just stop the program on the computer and you talk, and then you go on. And maybe someone in the group would take responsibility for listening to what I have to say ahead of the class. So you might know the places which might be of particular interest to yourself and to the class without necessarily having to go through it all. But what is of value is that we are reading the entire book, and nothing can take the place of doing that. Now, maybe, of course, it would be faster. You're sitting down, you're just reading the book, and you're going on. It's faster than my approach. My approach is sometimes to speak very slowly, and sometimes to speak very rapidly, sometimes to write commentaries down, and sometimes when I'm tired of doing that and I think it retards the progress too much, just to speak the commentaries without writing them down. The purpose of the commentaries is to relate what is said in this book to what is said in other books, so that we can begin to look at the teaching as a great wholeness, which essentially it is, spherical study. Everything DK has written is in a great sphere of knowledge and of wisdom. and everything must be related to everything else. Well, we can relate some things to other things. We are descending, from the soul to the mental body and into the astral body. And now we're about to undertake rules for the etheric plane and its relation to the dense physical plane in the last stage of the magical process, which is precipitory. We're about to have our thought form, our soul thought form, appear. And there are particular dangers involved in that. And as one can see, this is a very exacting study, especially if one looks at the rules and realizes that DK is only explaining a little bit regarding them, but that practical magic will one day be the order of the day, and when we are ready intellectually, it will be presented to us in such a way that we can proceed practically. And of course, we will have had to have proven ourselves, to have undergone tests and trials which determine our fitness to receive the practical information. So, it's a slog. I know you know, and I know by this time it's a slog. And sometimes, I wonder here how I can keep going, and if I have anything to say of value whatsoever. And great waves of fatigue come over me, and then sometimes I'm animated and full of what seems to be, for me, acute understanding. But the idea is to persist through the entirety of it, as I've done with esoteric astrology and the rays and the initiations and a treatise on cosmic fire, some of these big books and excerpts from Esoteric Psychology 2 and maybe a few from 1, and commentary upon the stanzas of Xian as they appear in this book, in the book of Cosmic Fire. So on Makara, thus far, you'll find quite a bit of commentary on the Tibetan's books. It's a very big output that he made, and and commentary, written commentary on Initiation Human and Solar, to be found so far on Makara. But is it necessary then to do them all? I think it's probably, of course, too much for me, but maybe others will come into this and offer their thoughts as they would in the context of deep study. So I realize, that in many respects I'm just scratching the surface. There may be places where I really, truly do misunderstand and offer even the wrong direction. I can't tell, because my method is to just keep going, just keep working through and sharing with you what comes to mind. It's the only way that one can cover the ground. So mistakes there will be, and maybe some errant paths. But if in general the reading through, the commentary on, and the linking up with other books of his and other aspects of spiritual occultism, if that linking up begins to appear to you, then the unification of the theosophical teaching will be on its way. And we have to unify not only what the Tibetans said, but factor in, as I tried to do, the secret doctrine and Agni Yoga. And all of this in anticipation of the coming installment, the third series in this series of what he calls bridging treatises towards the knowledge of the new age. And of course, I feel a little bit like Moses. He was able to look at the promised land from a high perspective, but he knew he was not allowed to go into the promised land. Okay. So I'll do what I can on this side and then wake up on the other side and hopefully be able to continue my association with this great presentation that the Tibetan has offered us, which will constantly illumine our mind and expand our heart and make us more acquiescent to the divine will and make us more likely to sacrifice in the right way. So next stop is Rule 12, 13, 14, 15. 4 rules remain. That's a much shorter section, of course. Under one half. I mean, it's not even half as long as what we've just been through, but will prove very valuable in the final stages of magic. So we'll get this out to you, and hopefully you'll be able to benefit from it. Meanwhile, lots of love, many blessings, and study hard. Getting to be my mantra, I guess, here. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.